I'll introduce now Bénédicte Michalon. Bénédicte is a geographer at CNRS. She studies migration and detention practices. Her research focuses on control devices of migration and their effect on the migrant experiences. She is a fellow at CIMigration, like our three speakers. She managed with Thomas Lacroix the Localac project you just mentioned, Mireille, founded by the CIMigration on urban and rural communities dealing with the welcoming of migrants. Bénédicte co-édited the article L'accueil des exilés dans les espaces ruraux en France, orientation nationale et déclinaison locale d'une politique de dispersion in the Revue européenne des migrations internationales 2020. Bénédicte, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my work today. I'm going to talk about the settlement of exiles in the countryside in France, because like many European states, France organizes the dispersal of asylum seekers on its territory. And this dispersal policy has existed since the mid-70s. It is done through the location of housing units, and it is operating through what is officially called the National Reception System, which I will refer to as the DNA. And the DNA encompasses various categories of housing, one of which is dedicated to asylum seekers. And this is the type of housing I will focus on today. Next slide, please. The deployment of the DNA has always gone by a policy to spread the housings all over the national territory. Since at least the late 90s, the housing systems has been in large parts deployed in areas with a low density of population that you can see on green charts on the maps. And this is meant to have all the territories taking their share on the housings and to try to counter the regrouping of migrants in the main cities and in the jungles of Calais and Paris. The French state decided on the location of the housing at the level of the departments, which are a territorial unit which is roughly equivalent to the British counties. The other key actors are the service providers. The French state delegates to them the management of the centers and certain administrative and social work with the exiles, such as filling the asylum application. These providers are most often local or national associations. How do they intervene in the dispersal policy? How does the location of many housing centers away from the main urban centers affect the way to house and to work with asylum seekers? I will propose some elements of analysis based on a fieldwork that I've been conducting since 2019 in a rural department in southwestern France. Today, this department comprises 4 centers for asylum seekers. The first one was established in 1998 in a village of 700 inhabitants, quite enclaved, and the 3 others were open since 2015 in several small and medium-sized towns. So my communication will shed light on the effects of the dispersal policy on the relationship between the 2 groups of actors, which are the social workers who work in the centers and the asylum seekers who live there. It seems to me that social work there takes on a new dimension, which is informal, because social workers aim to make exiles accept to live in rural areas and to settle them there. Next slide, please. So I will first talk about how service providers play into dispersal policy by capturing available housing to create centers for people in exile. All the housing centers open in existing buildings. There are 2 models. Next slide, please. The first model is concentrated accommodation, where all the asylum seekers live in the same place. And the offices of the service providers are usually on site, which allows for daily relations with the asylum seekers. It is the model of the oldest center, which was opened in the former workers' housing center in the village, that you can see on the picture on the left. Another center was opened in recent years in a former building of the French National Railway Company on the outskirts of a small town, and you can see it on the picture in the middle. The second model of accommodation is said diffuse. It is located in apartments or houses that most often belong to social housing landlords, and the units are scattered over a given territory. Service providers choose to disperse them in several small towns, and the social workers have separate offices. And you can see this in the picture on the right. You can see a housing unit in which several apartments are rented for asylum seekers, but there are also other inhabitants. These models are a choice made by the associations. And while the center located in the village is reputed to function well, it also serves as a counter model to other centers, which have been voluntarily established in a network of small and medium-sized towns. So I try to really explain why. Because when looking for housing, the associations have a list of criteria. The first is to disperse the housing units over several municipalities on a departmental scale. And associations have two explanations for that. On the one hand, they aim to avoid a concentration of exiles and to avoid their visibilization. They really look for their invisibility. On the other hand, they also want to bring asylum seekers to be autonomous. They insist on the need to empower them. And the issue of mobility is crucial here, because asylum seekers living in the village cannot get around on their own if they do not have their own car. And all other associations have considered this as a problem when they were looking for new housing possibilities. And finally, the public transportation was determining, and the new centers ended up being open in small and medium-sized towns. So in conclusion, although the French state decides in the last instance upon the housing choices, service providers clearly play a role in the dispersal of asylum seekers through the search of new housing possibilities. After that, they also play a key role when asylum seekers arrive in the department. And this is what I will talk about now in my second point. Next slide, please. Because asylum seekers who get an accommodation from the state cannot choose the location. So getting an accommodation means accepting to live in a place which you have not chosen. And it also means a journey from the place where the asylum seekers are to their new accommodation. Furthermore, asylum seekers are generally not informed as to their exact destination, especially when they are displaced from a distant region in France. Very often, the closest big city is presented to them by the agents of the state to obtain their agreement on the places they were allocated. But when they arrive in this big town, they discover that their accommodation is actually located elsewhere, more than an hour's drive away. And social workers must use the utmost finesse to explain that they are taking them to a small town or a village. One person sent from Paris, alone with small children, explained this very clearly to me. I won't read the whole quotation, but I just want to insist on the fact that she said, "The social worker calmed me down, made me forget what I saw on the left and on the right through the car window." And after that, she said, "When I saw the house, I thought, I can do this to the children. I can stay here." But the social workers helped me a lot. So social workers know how difficult it is for many of the asylum seekers to accept the countryside, because it means social isolation for them. They set up professional strategies to get the location accepted. For example, when women with children or alone are about to arrive, it is always women social workers who pick them up at the railway station to prevent any fear or panic during the travel. Upon arrival in the village, the team presentation and the interview with the director are planned as key moments to make the new residents accept the location. So social workers carry out persuasive work to prevent newcomers from leaving immediately the place. This work isn't in their official duties, but it comes to be a whole unofficial part of it. And the location of housing centers also configures everyday social work through a major issue, which is mobility. And this is what I will address now in my third point. Next slide, please. So once the arrival phase has passed, the management of the daily life is, as in every asylum seeker centers, to manage the weight. The ability to move or not to move is a determining factor in the daily life of both the asylum seekers and the social workers. It is a major concern in the center located in the village, as it is far from all public transport networks. And much of the work of the social workers team is devoted to organizing trips to nearby cities for routine medical or administrative purposes. Each week, a meeting is held to plan these trips. They represent more than one working day per week for each social worker. So it is really a big amount of time. And these hours could be considered as loss for the social and legal support, which is listed in the social workers task. However, most of them do much more than just transport. So here you have a whole quotation of a social worker. I will just read the end because it is really interesting. She said, "I have very concrete examples of people I work with for their asylum application who confided things in my car. It happened to me twice, and it was essential things that allowed them to have their papers. If we had not been together in the car, this physical displacement, we are side by side, we look far ahead, and we tell ourselves things that we do not say in an office in the context of the asylum application." So mobility are a specific time space to build a relation of trust, which helps to fill the asylum application. So this issue of mobility, it sheds light on the fact that the dispersal policy not only has strong impacts on the life of the asylum seekers, but also on the social workers who need to adapt their work to the specificities of the countryside. Next slide, please. The accommodation offered by the state ends up a few weeks after the asylum seekers have been granted protection or have been rejected. And this is what I will address now in my last point. It raises the issue of moving out of the centers. Social workers adapt their position to the expressed or perceived desire to join a big city. Each time a person leaves a center, social workers explain to her, "If you stay in the department, we will help you. If you want to go to the big city, we won't be able to do anything for you." What is being negotiated through these words is the lasting impact of the dispersal policy on the project of the exilees. For those who receive a protection from the French states, social workers seek new housing through specialized local institutions and social housing providers. Here, they highlight what they see as a special resources for the countryside. According to them, inter-knowledge would be facilitated, professional network would be very useful and more efficient than in large cities. New refugees seem to gather on the department's small and medium-sized cities, and this can be seen as a compromise between their own desires and the support that social workers are willing to provide if they remain in the department. The move and installation are presented as temporary by all. The issue is to find a kind of stability for a few years before a new residential mobility can be planned. For rejected asylum seekers, groups of volunteers take over. It is no longer the institutions that prevail, but solidarity networks. Two dynamics are here at work. Some of the rejected asylum seekers are relocated by volunteers in isolated areas, which are perceived as more protective. Others move to the small towns because they can have access there to the common charity networks, such as Emmaus, the Catholic Relief, or the Human Rights League. And those who manage to be sponsored by a solid structure, such as Emmaus, are then urged to stabilize, because the support they can benefit need them to remain there. In all cases, the exit of the center means moving once again. But this mobility is reduced by social networks that support exilees, whether by social workers or by volunteers. Support is provided within the department. So I will conclude very quickly on the main ideas that emerged from this analysis. The first I wish to stress on is why this policy of dispersal is a policy of the French state. It cannot be implemented locally without providers seeking homes and employing social workers. The policy of the service providers is therefore central to the deployment of the national reception system. The second idea is that service providers also have a policy of dispersal throughout the department, which leads to a differentiated geography of the reception, which is deployed both in villages as well as in small and medium-sized towns. The third idea I want to stress on is that the tasks of social workers are set out in a set of specifications that are theoretically the same for all asylum reception centers. However, they vary according to the location of the accommodation. My point here is to say that the location has a significant impact on the way in which social support is provided, and therefore on the relationship between the social workers and the asylum seekers. Finally, social workers carry out a work of persuasion. They try to convince people first to accept the countryside and later to remain in the department. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bénédicte. I think we will have many topics. We will find back many topics with the presentation of Cyril.